What if a billionaire's quiet secretary became the one person who stood between life and death for an entire hospital? On a stormy night in Savannah, when the power failed and machines began to die, Claire Whitman, a woman no one saw beyond her calendar, and notes suddenly held the fate of elders, patients, and families in her hands. Beside her was Grant Ellison, a man of wealth and vision, who carried his own scars from a childhood storm. Together, they would face not only the fury of nature, but betrayal hidden in contracts, the weight of public doubt, and the unspoken truth growing between them. How does an ordinary woman become the voice of trust in a city desperate for hope? How do two people, divided by roles and scrutiny, discover that compassion and transparency are stronger foundations than concrete or steel? This is not just the story of a storm, it is the story of Light Harbor, light and the people willing to keep it burning. If this story moves you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Because sometimes, the light you pass on is the one that saves a life. The storm had not been expected to hit Savannah for days. The forecasts had shown the swirling mass of clouds drifting north, bound for the Carolinas. People in Georgia had stocked up but relaxed, trusting the experts. Yet, as night pressed down, the National Weather Service issued a sudden update. The storm had shifted course, veering west, gathering strength. By the time the alert reached the coastal hospitals, Hurricane Helen was now a Category 3 barreling toward them at 75 miles an hour at Riverbend Community Hospital, a squat brick building that had served generations of Savannah families. The lights flickered. Inside the ICU, machines hummed in fragile rhythm. Each beep, each sigh of the ventilators was more than sound. It was breath borrowed from technology. Patients lay in their beds, thin hands clutching blankets, unaware of the fragile cord tying them to life. The staff moved quickly but quietly, as if afraid to disturb the storm gathering outside. Claire Whitman stood in her apartment a few blocks from the headquarters of Ellison Health Ventures, staring at the glowing map on her laptop. The red spiral pressing inland looked almost alive. She knew exactly what it meant for Riverbend. The generator there had a record of sluggish starts. If the grid went down for more than a minute, ICU patients could be in mortal danger. She was 35, young enough to still be called ambitious, but old enough to feel the weight of years that had hardened her edges. Claire had spent her 20s caring for her mother, who had slipped into Alzheimer's like a long winter. She knew the sound of a ventilator's rhythm, the way the power outages during summer storms could send a household into terror. When her mother passed, Claire carried forward a quiet vow. Never again would she stand powerless while machines dictated the margin between life and death. Now she worked as the executive secretary to Grant Ellison, billionaire founder of Ellison Health Ventures. Most people thought her job was arranging calendars, filtering emails, and booking flights. They didn't see the nights she stayed late in the office, reviewing hospital reports that others skimmed. She wasn't an executive. She wasn't a doctor, but she cared enough to notice. And tonight, something gnawed at her. The Harbor Light Project was supposed to be the answer. A new community shelter, designed to withstand hurricanes, equipped with redundant generators and stocked with medical supplies. Grant had poured millions into it, haunted by his own childhood memory of a rural hospital that had failed during an ice storm, leaving neighbors shivering in the dark. He had promised Savannah that Harbor Light would be their safety net, but Harbor Light was still weeks from breaking ground. Tonight, the old Riverbend had to carry the burden alone. Claire opened the checklist she kept in her private folder. It wasn't part of her job description. She did it because she couldn't sleep otherwise. Line by line. She checked allocations of backup power, ventilator capacity, fuel storage. Her pen tapped the desk when she reached the ICU distribution plan. The numbers didn't add up. The new wing had pulled resources, leaving the geriatric ward dangerously close to being underpowered in a full outage. Her stomach tightened. She remembered her mother's pale face, the way fear had lived in her eyes even when memory had gone. To die in confusion, in darkness, that was a cruelty she couldn't let happen again. She picked up the phone, hesitated, then called the after-hours line. A tired operator confirmed what she already suspected. The generator at Riverbend had a history of delays. They promised it would hold, but Claire heard the uncertainty behind the words. At Ellison Health Ventures, Grant Ellison sat in his corner office, the city spread before him in a quilt of street lamps. He was 44 now, his hair darker at the temples than it once had been, his face lined by years of negotiations and relentless ambition. He had built his empire from one urgent conviction that no community should suffer because a system had failed them. He still remembered being 12 years old, standing in the hall of a freezing hospital as nurses admitted they had no backup heat, no lights but flashlights. His mother had wrapped him in her coat, whispering that they would endure. That memory never left him. And so, when the alert about Riverbend reached his desk, something inside him clenched. He didn't see numbers or contracts. He saw faces. Patients like his mother's neighbors, frail and waiting. Claire's report arrived at the same time, flagged urgent. He scanned the neat lines of her handwriting, noting not just the figures but the foresight. She had caught something others missed. She was more than efficient. She was vigilant. Then the hotline rang. The words were clipped. Urgent generator, attempted start, failed. ICU running on battery, 45 minutes remaining. Claire froze. She could almost hear the machines gasping, the thin veil of time slipping away. She imagined the staff trying to reassure families, their own eyes betraying fear. She thought of her mother again, thought of the helplessness she had sworn never to repeat. At the headquarters, alarms lit the operations board. Grant pushed his chair back, rising with the calm urgency of a man who had waited for this test all his life. His voice was steady when he spoke, but his eyes carried the storm. "Activate emergency protocol," he ordered. Down the hall, Claire stood at her desk, hands gripping the edge as if bracing herself. She didn't wait to be asked. "I'll stay through the night," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone. For the first time, their roles blurred, no longer just a billionaire and his secretary, no longer just lines on a chart. Tonight, they were two people staring into the same storm, bound by the same vow, no one must be left in the dark. The countdown had begun. Savannah wore its history like moss draped over brick. The storm winds carried the scent of the Atlantic, sharp with salt, heavy with rain. On East Bay Street, the old cotton warehouses stood solid, reminders of centuries past. Yet, just a few blocks away, the Riverbend Community Hospital braced itself for a battle against time and weather. Its walls had sheltered generations, but the wiring, the pipes, the backup systems all carried the fatigue of decades. Inside Riverbend, the ICU glowed in dim light, nurses moving quickly between monitors, their shoes squeaking on polished but aging floors. The building smelled faintly of antiseptic layered over years of humidity. The warmth of human presence lingered here, familiar faces. Kind voices, but the structure itself groaned under pressure. Each gust of wind rattled the window frames, reminding everyone that the hospital was not invincible. Across town, Ellison Health Ventures sat in stark contrast. The headquarters was a modern cube of glass and steel, its lobby lined with pale stone, its offices equipped with silent air conditioning and glowing screens. Tonight, the boardroom had been transformed into a command post. A massive electronic display tracked Hurricane Helen's path, the red spiral inching toward Savannah. Smaller panels showed live feeds from Riverbend, Magnolia Court, and other facilities under the company's umbrella. Claire Whitman sat at the far end of the table, her laptop open, her notes arranged in careful order. She always came prepared, a habit learned from years of juggling work and caregiving. Even in crisis, she noticed details others missed, which folder was missing, which line in a report didn't match, which call had gone unanswered. Her colleagues thought of her as quiet, maybe too quiet. But beneath that calm exterior was a mind that refused to overlook what mattered. Grant Ellison moved differently. He stood at the head of the table, shoulders straight, voice clipped. He had the discipline of a man who had built something from nothing, who trusted procedure and demanded results. His black coffee sat cooling at his elbow, forgotten between rapid updates. Every so often, he rubbed the back of his neck, a sign only his longtime staff recognized as worry breaking through his armor. Claire glanced at him from her corner. She knew his habits too, the way he preferred his ties knotted just so, the way he ate lunch quickly and without conversation, the way he sometimes walked the halls late at night rather than going home. She had never asked about his past, but she sensed in him the same shadows she carried: the memory of loss, the fear of failing someone who depended on you. Her own reminders lived in small rituals. A lunch packed each morning, simple and nourishing, because eating alone at a desk had become second nature. Low-heeled shoes she could run in, because she had once sprinted across hospital corridors carrying paperwork when her mother's condition worsened. These habits were invisible to most, but they carried the weight of years of choices shaped by love and grief. At Magnolia Court, a senior housing complex near the marsh, the mood was tense. Residents gathered in hallways, the air thick with worry. Staff passed out flashlights, their voices calm but eyes betraying concern. The building stood in a flood-prone area, its foundation sturdy but vulnerable. The residents, many in their 80s and 90s, knew too well how storms could steal power, water, even dignity. For them, survival depended on the systems Riverbend and Ellison Health Ventures maintained. Back in the headquarters, Claire's screen flashed with a maintenance log. She frowned. The generator at Riverbend had been tested last week, but the entry looked odd. She zoomed in. The technician had signed off early, hours before the contracted shift was supposed to end. The note was brief, almost careless. She read it twice, 3 times, her pulse quickening. It wasn't negligence she feared, it was the consequences. A single shortcut could unravel everything. She thought of the ICU patients, the elderly at Magnolia Court, the fragile thread of trust holding families steady. She debated, for a moment, whether to speak. Secretaries weren't supposed to dig into maintenance logs. They weren't supposed to question contracts. Yet the storm outside roared louder, and the storm inside her heart left no choice. Quietly, she drafted a warning. She highlighted the discrepancy, noted the shortened shift, attached the log. Her message was clear: the generator may not hold. When Grant received it, his brow furrowed. He wasn't used to secretaries sending him flagged alerts in the middle of a crisis. He read the note twice, then looked across the room at Claire. For the first time, his gaze lingered not on her role, but on her presence. She wasn't just efficient. She wasn't just quiet. She had noticed what others overlooked. The wind howled against the glass walls of headquarters, rattling the frames. Riverbend trembled under its own strain. Magnolia Court braced for rising water. 3 places, 3 battles, bound together by the fragile thread of power. Grant set down his coffee at last. His voice was steady, but his eyes flickered toward Claire, acknowledging her in a way he never had before. And in that silence, she knew he had begun to see her differently, not just as a secretary, but as someone standing beside him in the storm. The storm was not done testing them. Not everyone could see where a system might break. Claire did. She saw it not as numbers on a screen, but as fragile threads that, if pulled wrong, unraveled into tragedy. She leaned closer to her laptop, her fingers steady though her pulse raced. The maintenance log had unsettled her already, but now she noticed something else. The serial number listed for the Riverbend generator didn't match the unit on the insurance file. It was subtle, a single digit out of place, but enough to make her stop breathing for a second. It meant one of 2 things. Either a clerical error had gone unnoticed, or, worse, someone had signed off on the wrong equipment. In storms like this, those mistakes weren't small. They were the difference between machines humming and machines failing. Claire began building a report, line by line. She cross-checked the insurance entry, the technician's notes, the supply contract. She highlighted discrepancies in red. It wasn't part of her job, not officially. She was supposed to keep schedules running, not verify equipment serials. But if no one else would, she would. Her thoughts kept circling back to faces she had glimpsed on visits to Riverbend, a frail man in a wheelchair with his daughter feeding him soup, a woman in her 70s humming hymns while waiting for her medication. They were the ones breathing through those machines tonight. They were the reason she couldn't shrug off the details. She pressed send. The report flew into Grant's inbox, marked urgent. Grant was standing by the main display, listening to updates about storm surge when his phone buzzed. He glanced down. Claire's name. He expected a scheduling note, maybe a reminder. Instead, he saw the words serial discrepancy and emergency risk. He read carefully, lips tightening. She hadn't just flagged a problem, she had built a case. Every line was precise, evidence stacked like bricks. He had spent his life surrounded by experts, advisors, consultants with fancy titles. Yet, here was his secretary, the woman who usually organized his flights, cutting through noise and pointing directly at the weak spot. He walked across the room, report still glowing in his hand. For the first time, he looked at her not as background support, but as someone holding real weight in this fight. "You caught this." His voice was low, more statement than question. Claire nodded. She felt her cheeks warm, but held his gaze. It didn't add up. For a moment, silence stretched between them. In it was something new: recognition. Grant turned to his team. "Claire will coordinate with tech staff on this. Make sure she has direct access." Several managers blinked, surprised. But no one argued. His tone left no room for debate. Claire felt the shift inside her like a door opening. She had been seen before, seen as efficient, reliable, discreet, but never as capable, never as someone trusted with more than schedules. Tonight, in the middle of a storm, she felt the weight of belief placed in her hands. She adjusted her headset, voice calm as she reached the Riverbend technician on duty. They worked through checklists together, her questions steady, her notes meticulous. She wasn't trained as an engineer, but she knew how to listen, how to catch the details that slipped through when panic pressed. Grant watched from across the table, his own thoughts tightening. He remembered being 12, seeing the lights go out in that rural hospital. He had sworn no one would endure that helplessness again. And here, in front of him, was someone carrying the same vow in her own quiet way. Their priorities aligned without a word. Both of them circled back to the ICU and the geriatric ward. Not revenue streams, not press headlines. People, the most vulnerable, the ones who couldn't move or flee or fend for themselves. The storm hammered harder against Savannah. Rain lashed windows. Wind roared like a freight train. At Riverbend, the technician's voice wavered. "We got it to start, but it's unstable." Claire's stomach dropped. Define unstable. Generator kicked on for 30 seconds, then shut itself down. Restart sequence failed. We're back on battery. How much time? The pause was brief but heavy. 45 minutes. Maybe less. Claire scribbled the number without realizing her hand was shaking. 45 minutes. That was all that stood between life and silence in the ICU. She relayed the update. The room went still. Even the storm outside seemed to hush for a heartbeat. Grant didn't wait. He grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair. "I'm going to Riverbend." One of his deputies started to protest. He cut them off with a look. "They need leadership on the ground. Keep the board running." Claire, his eyes locked on hers. "Coordinate from here. Keep me updated." She swallowed, then nodded. She wanted to tell him to be careful, to remind him that the storm outside wasn't forgiving, but the words stayed in her chest. Instead, she met his gaze steadily, letting him see what she couldn't say aloud. "I'll hold the line here." Grant strode toward the doors, the storm waiting to swallow him. Claire sat back down, headset firm, notes in front of her. Her heart pounded, but her hands were steady. For the first time, she wasn't just a secretary keeping schedules. She was part of the fight. The countdown to darkness ticked louder. The countdown began the moment Riverbend confirmed the generator had failed. 45 minutes of battery. 45 minutes to keep fragile lives breathing. Claire stared at the numbers glowing on her screen. She forced herself to breathe slowly, as though calm could buy more time. It couldn't, but panic would waste what they had left. She started a list. Patients on ventilators first, then those dependent on oxygen concentrators, then dialysis machines. Every name written meant a face she could see, not numbers, people. She spoke quickly into her headset, voice steady, asking the nursing staff to verify patient counts. Her pen tapped the desk, as if keeping rhythm with their responses. 3 on ventilators, 4 with oxygen dependence, 2 critical cardiac monitors. Claire drew a heavy line under the numbers, 9 lives tied directly to power. Next, she called the fire station 2 blocks from Riverbend. Static crackled on the line. Then a weary voice answered. They had portable oxygen tanks, a few backup batteries. She requested immediate support, her tone leaving no room for delay. Her next call was to a supplier who stocked portable ventilators. The storm had made deliveries impossible, but she pressed, asked if anyone on staff lived close enough to bring equipment in by truck. Every small step mattered. Every extra battery was a lifeline. Meanwhile, the storm pounded Savannah. Streets turned into rivers. Branches flew like spears. And in the middle of it, Grant Ellison's SUV pushed forward, headlights slicing through sheets of rain. His knuckles whitened on the wheel, not from fear of the storm, but from urgency deeper than fear. He had promised himself he would never watch a hospital fail again. Not while he had breath left to stop it. When he reached Riverbend, the parking lot was a sea of water. He splashed through, jacket plastered to his skin, storm tearing at his frame. Inside, chaos reigned. Nurses hurried with flashlights. Alarms beeped in uneven rhythm. The generator room smelled of oil and ozone. Grant didn't stand aside. He bent with staff to move portable units, his hands slick, muscles straining as they repositioned machines closer to critical wards. A clipboard was shoved into his hands. He signed without hesitation, authorizing electrical rerouting that would cut power from administrative wings and pour everything left into ICU and geriatrics. Back at headquarters, Claire coordinated each step. She kept her voice low and certain, repeating details like a heartbeat. Shift ventilator 2 onto portable power. Prioritize bed 7. Confirm backup oxygen for ward C. Her words moved like threads stitching chaos into order. She pictured the rooms, the people, an old woman who might be humming to herself, a man in a chair, his daughter still feeding him soup. They weren't abstractions. They were why her hands didn't shake. The technical team at Riverbend fought the generator. Sweat poured though the air was cold. They checked fuel lines, reset circuits, cursed the sluggish engine. One muttered that the parts didn't look right, too cheap, too thin, as if someone had cut corners. Claire heard it through her headset, wrote it down, noted it. The thought lodged like a stone in her chest. Not now. Later, right now, every second belonged to survival. Community volunteers began arriving despite the storm. A teacher with flashlights, a neighbor carrying a box of blankets, a college kid hauling cases of bottled water. They came soaked, shivering, but determined. Claire heard their names relayed over the line. She whispered them back like prayers. Humanity itself had answered the call. Minutes slipped away. 45 became 30. 30 shrank to 15. Each update felt like the tolling of a bell. In the ICU, nurses switched one patient to manual ventilation, hand squeezing a bag with steady rhythm. Another nurse prepared to do the same. Sweat rolled down their temples as they pumped life into fragile lungs, refusing to let darkness win. Claire gripped her pen so hard it nearly snapped. She spoke slowly, softly, reminding the team they were not alone. You're doing it. Every breath matters. Keep going. Grant moved from room to room, his shirt clinging, hair plastered. He wasn't the billionaire CEO here. He was another pair of hands, pushing, lifting, directing. Families clutched his arm, begging for reassurance. He gave it, even as his mind raced with dread. Then came the final minutes. 5 left. The technician shouted over the roar of failing circuits. "We're out of time for a moment." Silence gripped Claire's chest. Then she heard it, the steady hiss of oxygen from portable tanks, the measured squeeze of manual bags. They were holding the line, human strength replacing machine power. 45 minutes had become 0. And still, life continued, fragile, desperate, but unbroken. At last, the generator sputtered again. A cough, a grind, then a reluctant roar. Lights flickered, steadied, machines hummed. Relief poured like a flood. Claire sagged in her chair, tears burning but unfallen. Grant leaned against a doorway, chest heaving, eyes closing for one brief moment. Nurses cried softly, hugging each other even as they kept working. They had avoided tragedy by inches, but under the relief lurked a darker thought. If the parts were wrong, if someone had supplied substandard equipment, then tonight's terror wasn't just chance. It was betrayal. Claire wrote one last note in her report, her handwriting sharper than usual. Possible fraud, investigate supply chain. The storm still raged outside, but inside both Riverbend and the headquarters, something had shifted. Claire had not just managed calls. She had anchored the night, and Grant, watching her from the hospital floor through a storm-streaked video feed, saw her no longer as a secretary. Tonight, she was the backbone of the emergency. The clock no longer counted down, but their fight had only begun. When the winds eased and the water began to recede, Savannah felt heavier than before. Streets were littered with branches and shingles. Neon signs dangled half-broken, and the air smelled of wet wood and gasoline. But inside Riverbend, the silence that followed was filled not with relief, but with the faint tremor of patients' breaths, the rustle of blankets, the quiet sobs of families who had survived the night. Claire walked slowly through the ward, clipboard tucked to her chest. She greeted each nurse by name, asked about the patients one by one. Her eyes lingered on the elderly, most of all, the woman who still hummed even in exhaustion, the man whose daughter had dozed off in a chair, holding his fragile hand. She thought of her mother again, thought of nights when she had watched the same tremor in worn fingers. What storms left behind, more than damage, was fragility. Grant arrived from the ICU, his shirt still damp, his hair pushed back carelessly. He looked less like a billionaire than a man who hadn't slept, yet his voice was steady as he joined Claire in reviewing the damage reports. They spoke in low tones, piecing together what had gone wrong, what had barely held, and what had failed altogether. Riverbend held, Claire said, her voice even, but just barely. Next time, she trailed off. Next time was inevitable. Grant nodded, his jaw tight. Harbor Light has to be ready. She opened her notebook, the same one she used to jot schedules, and showed him sketches. Not polished blueprints, just lines and notes. "We need more than stronger walls," she said. "A community kitchen that doubles as a warming center. Generators prioritized for ICU and geriatrics, not admin wings. Rescue ramps wide enough for stretchers. Charging stations for portable medical devices." Her pen tapped each note as though each idea had weight. She wasn't an architect, but she was a daughter who had lived the small indignities of crisis-cold meals, powerless machines, doors too narrow for wheelchairs. She had seen where systems failed because they forgot the human details. Grant listened, his brow furrowed, but there was something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Not skepticism, respect. He picked up her paper, studied it. "These aren't afterthoughts," he said quietly. "They're the difference between survival and dignity." The words sank into her chest like warmth. For years she had carried her ideas silently, folded into the margins of her notebooks. To have them recognized, not dismissed, it was a kind of healing she hadn't expected. Later, as the sun broke briefly through the clouds, volunteers brought coffee in paper cups. Grant handed one to Claire without speaking, just a small gesture, but she felt the heat through the cup and through her chest. She noticed, too, how he shrugged off his raincoat and draped it over the shoulders of a nurse shivering near the entrance. These weren't grand acts, but the quiet language of trust. That night, back at headquarters, she found a sticky note left on her desk. In his sharp handwriting it read, "Your notes from Riverbend. Keep developing them. We'll need them." She pressed it flat with her palm, holding it longer than necessary, as if it were proof that her voice finally mattered. But in the wider halls of Ellison Health Ventures, whispers had already begun. Staff who had seen her coordinating through the night spoke about how close she and Grant had seemed, how he had relied on her. By morning, the rumors had grown. Some said she was more than a secretary now. Others hinted at closeness they could not prove. Claire kept her head down, but she felt the eyes linger when she passed. The weight of perception pressed harder than she expected. She wasn't afraid of hard work, but she was afraid of being misunderstood, of her mother's memory being clouded by idle talk. She wanted her worth to be measured by what she had done that night, not by speculation. Grant noticed too. He didn't mention it, but she caught the flicker in his expression when an aide lowered their voice as he walked past. He knew the currents of gossip, and he knew they could stain reputations faster than truth could repair them. Still, neither of them spoke it aloud. Instead, they focused on plans. They stayed late, reviewing reports, refining lists. Sometimes the conversations drifted, and in those moments the walls between them thinned. Grant told her, in a low voice, about the ice storm of his childhood, the one that had left his family wrapped in coats inside a freezing hospital. He remembered the sound of coughing echoing in the dark, the smell of kerosene lamps burning too close to curtains. That night had made him who he was. Claire listened, her throat tight, and then shared her own memory. Her mother, sitting by the window during a summer blackout, her hands trembling as she tried to remember a hymn she once knew by heart. Claire had lit candles, whispered that she was safe, but the truth was, she had been terrified. Their stories overlapped not in detail, but in ache. They both knew what it meant to feel helpless, to lose faith in systems that should have protected the most vulnerable. And in that overlap, something stronger than strategy formed, trust, days later. As the city began assessing recovery, a letter arrived from the Department of Public Health. Grant opened it at the conference table, Claire sitting across. The words were plain but heavy, due to questions about Riverbend's generator and potential contractor misconduct. Harbor Light would require independent oversight before final approval. Grant's jaw tightened. Independent oversight meant outside control, a message of distrust. Claire reached for the document, scanning it quickly. At the bottom was a list of potential candidates for the role. Her breath caught when she saw her own name printed there. Claire Whitman. The room felt suddenly smaller. She looked up, meeting Grant's eyes. For the first time since the storm, uncertainty rippled between them. She was no longer just his secretary. She was someone the city might place between him and his own project. The storm outside had passed, but another one had just begun. Sometimes, to keep a dream alive, people had to step back from each other. The letter from the Department of Public Health was brief, but its meaning stretched long into the silence that followed. Claire read her name again and again, as though repetition might change the reality. Independent oversight, a new role, and if she accepted, she could no longer serve as Grant's secretary. The next morning, she arrived at headquarters with her resignation already drafted. Her desk, so familiar with its neat stacks of folders and carefully placed pens, looked suddenly temporary. She had lived years in this corner, balancing calendars and solving small crises before they grew. But now, to serve the city, she had to let it go. Grant met her in the boardroom, the same place where they had weathered the storm. He didn't sit. He stood by the window, watching clouds drift across the river. His silence was heavier than words. "I have to take it," Claire said softly. Her hands were clasped together, tight enough that her knuckles ached. "If I don't, the project loses credibility." Grant nodded once, but his jaw tightened. "I know." They both understood what the change meant. No more late-night briefings side by side. No more quiet notes passed across the table. No more unspoken comfort in small gestures. Instead, protocols, boundaries, everything filtered through official channels. By noon, her email signature had changed. Claire Whitman, Community Oversight Coordinator. The title looked formal, distant. She felt the weight of it each time she typed her name. Reporters circled like gulls over the river. The story of the storm had spread beyond Savannah. Ann Harbor Light had become a symbol. Every move was scrutinized. The city wanted to know if Ellison Health Ventures had cut corners. The company wanted to defend its reputation. And in the middle stood Claire, carrying a badge that now placed her on the opposite side of the table from the man she had once served. At meetings, she kept her voice calm, her questions professional. She asked for documents, requested clarification, pressed for answers when the paper trail faltered. Grant answered with equal professionalism, his tone clipped but never unkind. They spoke as colleagues, not as confidants, and yet, in the spaces between words, there lingered the memory of a night when they had fought together against time itself. The hardest moments came not in confrontation, but in absence. She missed the small rituals, the way he left a fresh cup of coffee on her desk, the way he nodded in quiet approval when she caught a detail others missed. Now, when she passed his office, she kept walking. When their eyes met across a crowded briefing, they both looked away too quickly. One evening, after a long day of audits, Claire stopped at a grocery store near her apartment. She stood in line with milk, bread, and a small carton of strawberries. Around her, families chatted, couples argued lightly over brands of cereal. She felt suddenly alone, more than she had in years. The distance between her and Grant was professional, yes, but it cut deeper than that. She had found someone who saw her worth, and now she had to pretend the recognition didn't matter. Grant felt it too. In the solitude of his office, he sometimes reached for his phone, tempted to send a message that wasn't about contracts or inspections. But professionalism pressed like a weight on his chest. He couldn't risk undermining the project. He couldn't risk undermining her. Instead, they both poured themselves into Harbor Light. The project became their common ground, even if they now stood on opposite sides of its foundation. Weeks passed, documents piled higher, audit teams combed through invoices. One night, Claire sat at her kitchen table, reviewing copies of supply orders. She circled dates, highlighted mismatched signatures. Something about the chain of receipts felt off. The next morning, she presented her findings to the committee, a string of maintenance contracts, all linked to the same subcontractor, carried irregularities, hours billed that didn't align with logs, equipment purchased at prices that didn't match the models delivered. On paper, it looked small. In reality, it suggested something larger: fraud. The word hung unspoken, but everyone in the room felt it. Grant's face hardened as he scanned the report. For him, it wasn't just about numbers. It was about trust betrayed, about lives endangered by greed. Claire watched his hands tighten on the folder. She knew what it cost him to build something on faith in others and discover the foundation was cracked. Her heart ached to speak comfort, but her role demanded distance. The meeting ended with the announcement of the next step, an on-site inspection. Teams would walk the grounds, review materials, verify every bolt and beam. It was necessary. It was also dangerous. Rumors already swirled that the contractor, desperate to protect itself, might resist scrutiny. As Claire packed her papers, she felt Grant's gaze from across the table. For a moment, the professional mask slipped. She saw in his eyes the same loneliness she carried. But then he looked away, and the distance returned. She walked out into the evening light, the sound of cicadas rising in the humid air. She told herself this was what integrity required: boundaries, sacrifice. But as she unlocked her car, she whispered the truth she couldn't deny. Dreams demanded not only courage, but loss. The storm had tested their resolve. Now, bureaucracy and suspicion would test their bond. The date for inspection was set, and both knew the hardest part was still ahead. Some explosions do more than shatter walls. They tear apart boundaries people fought to hold. The inspection at Riverbend began under gray skies. A team of auditors, engineers, and city officials filed through the aging halls, clipboards in hand. Claire walked with them, professional mask steady, though her heart beat faster with each doorway they passed. Grant trailed close behind, speaking when asked, silent otherwise. In the generator room, the air was damp, heavy with oil and dust. Flashlights swept across machines, lingering on labels and gauges. One auditor crouched, running his finger along the serial plate. He frowned. "This unit doesn't match the paperwork," he said. His voice carried in the cramped space. Another pulled out a folder, flipping pages quickly. "These receipts show a newer model. This one's at least 10 years old." Claire's pen scribbled the details even as her chest tightened. The discrepancy she had suspected was no clerical error. The machine in front of them had been swapped. Someone had delivered older equipment under the guise of new. The engineers worked quietly, but their faces betrayed anger. Swapped machines meant false signatures, falsified logs, fraud. And not by accident, someone in the middle had pocketed the difference. Grant stood rigid, his hands balled into fists. He looked at the humming machine as though it were a living betrayal. All the money, all the promises, and still greed had slipped through cracks meant to protect lives. Then it happened. A sharp crack, then a low boom. Sparks burst from a junction box, followed by the acrid stench of burning wires. The room filled with smoke as technicians shouted, "Back, everyone, back!" But one younger engineer froze, eyes wide, caught too close to the sparks. Without pause, Grant lunged forward. He shoved the man aside just as a second pop sounded, metal fragments scattering. Pain ripped through Grant's shoulder. He staggered, teeth clenched, but stayed upright. Claire's heart lurched. For a moment she forgot titles, oversight, everything. She pushed through the crowd, calling his name. He stood braced against the wall, face pale but steady. Blood seeped through his sleeve where fabric had torn. "Get medical here now," Claire ordered, her voice sharper than she knew she possessed. But Grant shook his head. "Help them first," he rasped, nodding toward the technicians. Her throat tightened, even hurt. He thought of others first. The inspection halted, chaos replacing procedure. Fire alarms echoed. Smoke curled through corridors. Claire found herself at the center again. Headset crackling, phone pressed to her ear. She coordinated evacuations, directed staff to seal off the generator room, and reassured frightened patients that the danger was contained. Hours stretched. The storm outside had passed, but inside Riverbend another kind of storm raged. Reporters caught wind of the incident, their questions already biting at the edges of the night. Why had outdated equipment been installed? Who was responsible for the explosion? Why was the CEO himself inside when it happened? Through it all, Claire refused to leave. She stayed in the hospital, walking halls with a notepad, checking on staff, making sure no one was left behind. She knew what it would look like, oversight officers staying through the night, side by side with the man she was supposed to scrutinize. Rumors would grow louder, but she didn't care, not when lives had been at stake. Near dawn, she found herself sitting outside the treatment room where Grant's shoulder had been bandaged. The hallway was quiet, lit only by the soft hum of fluorescent lights. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees, exhaustion pressing deep into her bones. She thought of the boundary they had drawn, professional distance, polite formality. Tonight that line had burned with the wires. When she saw him hurt, she hadn't thought of protocols. She had thought only of him. Grant emerged, arm in a sling. He looked tired, older than usual, but his eyes met hers and held. For a moment, neither spoke. In the silence, the truth was clear. No report, no contract could hide it. What they carried was no longer just duty. Claire rose slowly, words stuck in her throat. She wanted to tell him to rest, to stop carrying the world on his shoulders. Instead, she said the only thing safe enough. The team's stable. No one else was injured. He nodded, but his gaze lingered. Gratitude? Yes. Something more, unspoken. As the sun edged over Savannah, The hospital exhaled a weary calm, but outside, a different storm gathered. News vans parked at the curb. Headlines would soon roar about fraud, explosions, and the injured billionaire. Questions would multiply. Claire knew what had to come next. Hiding would only feed suspicion. They would have to tell the truth, every discrepancy, every flaw, every risk uncovered. Total transparency was the only way forward. She looked at Grant, saw the same resolve in his face. The project was no longer his alone, no longer hers to oversee from a distance. It was theirs. In the truest sense, not because of affection whispered, but because of responsibility shared. The boundaries they had tried so hard to guard had cracked, and in that fracture, something undeniable had taken root. The morning was quiet for now, but the tide of questions, the scrutiny of the public, was already on its way. When trust is tested by fire, there is only one way forward. You open every door. The morning after the generator explosion, Savannah woke to headlines sharp as knives. Fraud at Riverbend explosion injures CEO. Community project at risk. Reporters stood outside the hospital, cameras aimed at the glass doors, waiting for a statement. Inside, Grant and Claire sat at a long oak table, papers stacked between them. His arm was bound in a sling, but his posture was steady. She had her notes, every line underlined twice. The night's exhaustion clung to them, yet both knew what had to be done. No more half-truths, no more silence. The decision came quickly. All records would be released to investigators, every contract, every receipt, every inspection log. No redactions, no delays. The fraud was real, but it would not be hidden. Grant signed the authorization with his good hand. The pen pressed hard, leaving a groove in the page. Claire collected the files, labeling them carefully. Transparency was no longer a talking point. It was their survival. By noon, a public announcement went out. Ellison Health Ventures would terminate contracts with the implicated contractor. A new bidding process would begin, overseen by independent auditors. Progress and spending would be posted on a digital dashboard, open for the public to see. The words were clear, almost severe. But for Claire, what mattered was the subtext. They were saying, "We have nothing to hide. We will not let this project rot from within." Her own role shifted too. The city expanded her oversight duties, giving her authority to monitor every change order, every invoice. She set up a 24-hour hotline for seniors, where anyone could call with questions or concerns. She hired volunteers to staff it, trained them to speak with patience and warmth. In her small office at City Hall, Claire tested the phone lines herself, listening to the ring, imagining the trembling voice of an older man or woman on the other end. She remembered her mother, alone some nights, confused by medication schedules, frightened by storms. If Harbor Light was to be more than concrete and glass, it had to answer those fears. Grant respected the boundary now. He did not call her after hours, did not blur lines. When they met in meetings, he kept to business, and she matched him. Yet beneath the professional words ran a current both could feel. They were bound not by romance whispered in the corners, but by the weight of a promise larger than themselves. Reporters asked about their closeness. Claire answered calmly, "This is not about us. It's about elders who need a safe place. It's about integrity." And strangely, the more she said it, the truer it became. To love this mission was to love something greater than her own story. Then something unexpected happened. The community, instead of recoiling from the scandal, leaned in. Survivors of the storm wrote letters, published essays, shared memories on local radio. A nurse described the night she carried flashlights down dark ICU corridors. A volunteer told of pushing gurneys while thunder cracked above. An elderly woman, voice shaking, said simply, "They kept us alive." Donations began to pour in, not just from wealthy donors, but from grocery clerks, retirees, school teachers. $10 here, 20 there. A jar set out at a diner filled with singles and coins. Someone painted a sign, "Harbor Light is for us all." The dashboard. Claire helped design lit up with color-coded charts, dollars received, expenses listed, milestones checked, people clicked, refreshed, shared links. For the first time, the community could see where every cent went. And they believed. Grant stood at a press conference one afternoon, sling still around his shoulder, voice rough but clear. "This project belongs to Savannah," he said, "and Savannah has chosen to stand with us." The applause that followed was not polite. It was thunderous, raw. Claire listened from the side, notebook in hand. Pride warmed her. But it was not pride in him alone. It was pride in what people could do when fear turned into resolve. At the close of the meeting, the city announced a new plan, a public drill, 60 minutes without power. The test would simulate another storm, another outage, showing whether the safeguards worked. It would be open to observers, recorded for transparency. For Grant, it was a trial by fire. For Claire, it was accountability made flesh. That night, back in her apartment, she lit a single candle on the table, watching the flame dance. She thought about the people who would move into Harbor Light. The widows with pillboxes, the veterans with worn-out knees, the grandmothers raising grandchildren on fixed incomes. Could a building, no matter how well designed, carry the weight of such fragile lives? Her phone buzzed with a message from a volunteer. The hotline just got its 100th call today. People are asking when they can sign up for Harbor Light. Claire smiled softly. Fear had not driven them away. It had pulled them closer. She leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment. Transparency had cost them pride, convenience, maybe even privacy. But it had given something stronger in return. Trust, and trust, once planted, could grow roots deep enough to weather any storm. 1 hour without power, 1 hour measured on the breath of the old, 1 hour to prove that promises could be trusted. The test was announced weeks in advance. Flyers went out across Savannah Public Safety Drill, Harbor Light, all welcome to observe. The goal was clear: simulate a storm, cut the electricity, see if the system held. Claire arrived early that morning, notebook under her arm, a thermos of coffee in hand. She had barely slept, but her mind was alert. The building gleamed with fresh paint, wide ramps, and reinforced glass. Volunteers bustled in, some wearing church t-shirts, others from the fire station. Nurses from Riverbend signed in with clipboards. The heart of the drill was simple. At exactly 10 o'clock, the main power would be shut off. Generators, batteries, and manual backups would take over. Everything would be timed, documented, reviewed, no excuses. At 9:30, Claire walked the halls. She passed rooms staged with volunteer patients, seniors who had offered to participate. Some sat in wheelchairs, others lay in beds with mock IV bags attached. "We want to help," one white-haired man told her with a wink. Better to practice now than panic later. Her throat tightened. These weren't just props. They were living reminders of what was at stake. In the control room, Grant stood beside engineers from the new contractor. His sling was gone, though his arm still carried stiffness. He reviewed diagrams with calm authority, pausing to ask questions, making sure nothing was overlooked. When Claire entered, he glanced up briefly, a silent acknowledgement, professional, steady. But his eyes lingered one heartbeat too long. At 10 sharp, the switch was thrown. Lights blinked out. The hum of the air system stopped. For a second, silence held. Then, almost seamlessly, the backup generator roared to life. Red emergency strips glowed along the floor. ICU monitors blinked green. Nurses checked vital signs. The clock started counting. Claire moved station to station. "How long to switch?" she asked. 4 seconds. A technician answered. She wrote it down. At the pharmacy counter, refrigerated medications were checked for stable temperature. At the nurse station, tablets connected to wireless backup. Every detail mattered. At the 20-minute mark, a simulated complication. One generator was manually shut down. Staff rerouted power, rolling in portable battery packs. No panic, no confusion, just quick hands, clear voices. Meanwhile, another innovation was being tested. Claire had designed small laminated care cards distributed to low-income seniors. Each card carried emergency contacts, medication lists, and transport arrangements. During the drill, volunteers pulled out their cards, showing how paramedics could instantly know what each person needed. Simple, effective. By 30 minutes, the drill expanded beyond the walls. At a nearby church, bells rang to signal participation. The fire station tested radio links with Harbor Light. A local foundation brought vans equipped with extra chargers for medical devices. It wasn't just one building under test. It was a network, a community woven together. Grant watched from the control room, his jaw set but his eyes shining. This was what he had dreamed of, not just a facility, but a living system of care. Claire felt it too. Each phone call answered, each wheelchair moved, each volunteer trained. It was proof that Harbor Light could stand when storms came again. At 50 minutes, the biggest challenge hit. Simulated storm debris damaged an entry line. Power flickered. Staff followed protocol, shifting loads again. Volunteers moved with practiced ease, pushing patients towards safer zones. No one shouted, no one froze. The building bent but did not break. At exactly 60 minutes, main power was restored. Lights brightened. Air systems whirred back to full strength. A round of applause broke out. Spontaneous, relieved. Nurses hugged. Volunteers cheered. Some seniors wiped tears from their eyes. Claire closed her notebook, her hand trembling slightly. She exhaled for what felt like the first time all day. It had worked. The independent inspectors tallied results, transfer time, under 5 seconds. No critical failure. Communications intact. Impressive. One said. Claire caught the faintest smile on Grant's face, pride tempered by relief. But the day's news wasn't finished. That afternoon, the official investigation report was released. The fraud at Riverbend was traced back through forged documents and bribes to a subcontractor network. Names were listed, charges recommended. Ellison Health Ventures was cleared of direct blame. Their push for transparency had, in fact, accelerated the discovery. The vindication hit like sunlight after storm clouds. Grant read the statement aloud to his team. EHV demonstrated good faith, full cooperation, and commitment to public welfare. His voice cracked, just slightly, on the last words. Claire stood in the back of the room, unnoticed for a moment. A wave of emotion rose in her chest. All those nights of doubt, of whispered suspicion, had not been wasted. The truth had come out. In the quiet after, she slipped outside. The sky was streaked with late afternoon light, soft gold against the rooftops. Children rode bikes near the fence. An old woman in a straw hat sat with a granddaughter, pointing toward Harbor Light as if telling a story. Claire thought of her mother, of nights by the bedside, holding hands through confusion, of promises whispered silently. You will not be forgotten. You will not be left alone. This was the answer, not perfection, not glory, but systems that worked, tested in daylight, open to all, later. As the board gathered to vote, a date was chosen, the grand opening of Harbor Light. Flyers would go out again, but this time with brighter words. Join us for the dedication, a place of safety, a place of dignity. The city was waiting, and Claire knew, deep in her bones, that the hour they had just survived was more than a test. It was a vow. When the ribbon was cut, the brightest light was not the new LEDs. It was the quiet shine in the eyes of elders who finally knew they had a place to shelter. The courtyard of Harbor Light was filled with people that morning. Folding chairs lined the walkway. Flags fluttered in the coastal breeze, and a brass band tuned instruments under a white tent. Claire stood near the front, her badge clipped neatly to her blazer, notebook in hand as always. She had come to witness, but also to record. Grant walked onto the stage, still moving carefully after weeks of recovery. Though the sling was gone, he paused, surveying the crowd. There were officials from City Hall, reporters with cameras, pastors from local churches, and, most importantly, dozens of seniors from neighborhoods across Savannah. Some leaned on canes, others sat in wheelchairs, faces shaded by hats. Every expression carried expectation. Today, Grant began, voice firm. We open not just a building, but a promise. Harbor Light exists because this city believed we could do better for our elders, and because, when tested, we chose transparency instead of shadows. Applause broke, steady and heartfelt. Claire felt her chest tighten. She had heard many speeches, but this one rang with something different. It wasn't corporate polish. It was lived truth. Tours followed. Groups moved through wide hallways lined with handrails. Volunteers guided them into the community kitchen, where pots simmered with donated gumbo and cornbread baked in warm ovens. In the medical wing, technicians demonstrated portable chargers for oxygen tanks, showing how quickly they could be swapped during outages. At the recreation room, children colored at tables while grandparents watched from padded chairs. Claire lingered at the charging station, running her hand over the smooth surface of a new generator. Not just a machine, she thought, a safeguard, a covenant carved in steel. That afternoon, newspapers across the Southeast carried the story. Savannah opens first transparent senior shelter. Articles praised the digital dashboard, the hotline, the integrity of the process. Editorials called it a model for coastal towns facing stronger hurricanes each year. By evening, Grant's office phone rang with requests from Charleston, Jacksonville, even Wilmington. Could they send staff to learn, could Harbor Light be replicated? The idea spread like a tide, a network of safe harbors, dots of light along the vulnerable shoreline. The city celebrated, but the true test came unexpectedly. As speeches wound down and the brass band struck a final note, clouds gathered, thunder rolled over the river, a sudden storm, not forecasted, swept in with sheets of rain. The crowd gasped as the lights flickered, then cut out entirely. For a split second, silence, the kind that makes hearts stop. Then, as if rehearsed, the backup system surged, generators hummed. Emergency strips glowed along the floors. Air units resumed with steady rhythm. Nurses continued their tours without missing a step. Screens showed power transfer logs in real time. The crowd erupted in applause louder than for any ribbon cut, louder than for any speech. This was the real exam, and the building had passed before hundreds of witnesses. Claire exhaled, a laugh breaking free despite herself. She glanced toward Grant. He stood at the edge of the platform, rain spattering his suit, watching the lights steady. Their eyes met across the space. No words, only the shared relief of two people who had carried this weight for so long. Elders clapped, children pointed at glowing hallways. A pastor wiped his eyes. "It works," someone whispered. "It really works." By the time the sun dipped low, the rain had eased. The crowd dispersed slowly, reluctant to leave the glow of safety. Volunteers handed out bowls of gumbo, laughter rising in the steam. That night, Claire walked through the halls again, this time quieter. She paused at the kitchen where an elderly woman ladled soup, humming to herself. At the charging station, a young man tested outlets, nodding with satisfaction. At the recreation room, chairs were stacked neatly, crayons tucked away. Harbor Light was alive, not just brick and circuits, but heartbeat and breath. Grant found her near the courtyard, where puddles reflected the new lights. "We survived our first storm," he said softly. His voice was tired, but warm. Claire nodded, and with the whole city watching, for the first time in months, there was no press waiting, no investigator demanding answers, just the murmur of people settling into a safe space, just the soft glow of lights designed never to fail again. They walked out together, steps slow, as if unwilling to leave. The air smelled of wet earth and salt. Savannah's skyline shimmered in the distance. That evening belonged not to policy or headlines, but to quiet peace. Claire carried her notebook, though she did not open it. Grant carried his coat, though he never put it on. Side by side, they let the silence speak. For Claire, the peace felt fragile, like porcelain. But for once, she allowed herself to rest in it. She thought of her mother, of nights spent fearing shadows. If only she had seen this place, these lights. Grant glanced at her as they walked. He didn't speak, but his expression carried the same thought they had built something more enduring than either could have imagined. The storm had tested them once more, and once more. The light had held. Between the clink of spoons against pots and the smell of hot cornbread, the elders told how they had survived the storm. What they remembered most was not the wind. It was the hands that had held them. The community kitchen of Harbor Light glowed warm that evening. Long wooden tables stretched across the room, covered in simple cloths. Pots of stew steamed on the counter. Cornbread, fresh from the oven, filled the air with a scent so comforting it silenced conversation for a moment. Claire carried trays, sleeves rolled up, her hair loosely tied back. She moved from table to table, refilling cups, checking on guests. Tonight she wasn't an overseer or a city official. She was just a woman helping to serve supper. Grant sat at one of the benches, his tie loosened, listening as an elderly man in a plaid shirt described the night the power had gone out. "It wasn't the dark that scared me," the man said, voice rough but steady. "It was remembering being 12, stuck in a storm with no one there. But this time, someone came, you came." His eyes misted, and he lifted his bowl. "That stew tastes like safety." Laughter rose around the table, soft but strong. Stories spilled from one end of the room to the other. A nurse recalled pushing beds by flashlight. A volunteer remembered making coffee at 3 a.m. while lightning cracked. Tears slipped through, but so did joy. Survival had a sound, and it was this mixture of laughter and weeping. At the far wall, a new bench had been placed. A small brass plate gleamed on its backrest. Claire's breath caught when she saw the inscription, "In memory of Margaret Whitman, whose courage in illness inspired Harbor Light." Her mother's name. Her mother's fight. Claire reached out, fingers tracing the letters. It was not a grave. It was a promise, engraved into the wood of a place where others would rest. Grant joined her quietly, setting down 2 mugs of sweet tea. He didn't speak, but his presence was enough. She sat, and for a moment, the chatter of the hall receded. The weight she had carried for years, nights by her mother's bedside, the helplessness of not being able to stop decline softened. Here, her mother's name was not tied to loss. It was tied to light. The evening continued with small honors. Nurses received hand-painted thank you cards. Volunteers were applauded, some blushing, some wiping their eyes. A retired fireman played guitar softly in the corner. Children passed out cookies wrapped in napkins. Healing wove itself into each gesture. Then came a moment Claire would never forget. An elderly woman with silver hair pinned neatly back stood and shuffled to the front. In her wrinkled hands she carried a small flashlight, the kind with chipped paint and a worn rubber switch. "This kept me through Hurricane Floyd," she said, voice trembling but clear. "When the lights failed, this was my harbor. But I don't need it anymore. Harbor Light is here now." She placed the flashlight on the table, its beam flickering faintly before settling. "Let this be our lighthouse, our sign that trust was not broken." Silence filled the kitchen, thick with reverence. Claire's eyes stung. Grant bowed his head. For all the advanced systems, for all the millions invested, it was this battered flashlight that captured the meaning of what they had built, a symbol of fear carried for decades, now passed on as faith in something stronger. Applause began softly, then grew, until the whole room stood, clapping not for power grids or budgets, but for the courage to believe again. Later, as the hall quieted, Claire and Grant walked outside. The night was cool, the smell of salt carried on the wind. From the courtyard, the building's lights glowed steady, reflected in puddles from the afternoon rain. They paused by a map displayed in the lobby window. Red pins marked Savannah. Yellow pins stretched up the coast: Charleston, Wilmington, Norfolk, downward to Jacksonville, Miami, potential sites, hopes for future harbors. Grant tapped the glass. "How many more lights can we set?" Claire folded her arms, leaning closer. as many as it takes, until no one waits in the dark again. Their words were not dramatic, not wrapped in romance, but beneath them was something deeper, a sense of home that extended beyond walls, a belief that home could mean any place where light and safety met. For once, they did not hurry away. They stood in the quiet, letting the idea settle. The laughter from the kitchen echoed faintly. The smell of cornbread lingered. The battered flashlight sat on the counter inside, waiting for its new place of honor. For Claire, the night felt like healing. For Grant, it felt like beginning. For both. It was proof that when people chose to build with trust, the result could outshine any storm. And though they did not say it aloud, both knew the next chapter was already calling. The map of the coast shimmered with unanswered questions. How many more elders waited for light? How many more hands were ready to help? The kitchen lights glowed behind them, steady as stars. Not everyone can build a hospital. But everyone can light a lamp for another in the storm. Claire often thought back to that first night the storm, the failing generator, the frantic countdown of 45 minutes. She had entered the crisis as a secretary, armed only with a notebook and instinct. She had emerged as something else, not a title, not a role, but a keeper of lifelines. Her journey was not about climbing higher, but about standing steadier. She had learned that real authority came not from nameplates on doors, but from trust earned in the darkest hours. Grant's journey mirrored hers. A man once driven by wealth and vision had discovered that the truest investment was not steel or glass, but transparency and compassion. Harbor Light had become proof that when trust was broken, it could be rebuilt if one dared to open every door. Now, as the building thrived, Claire saw its meaning ripple outward. Elders laughed in the recreation hall. Volunteers gathered in the kitchen, stirring stew while children set the tables. Nurses walked halls that glowed with steady light, not the fragile flicker of candles. Each ordinary act was extraordinary because it answered fear with care. But this story was never only theirs. Think back, have you cared for an aging parent, waiting through the night, afraid the power might fail? Have you shared candles with neighbors during an outage, swapping flashlights and blankets? Have you opened your door to someone who needed shelter, even for a single storm? These are lights too, not grand, not loud, but lights that change nights into survivable mornings. The foundation of Harbor Light was not money, not blueprints, it was trust. Trust built by transparency, compassion, and courage. These three things are not rare resources. They live in every home, in every hand willing to reach for another. One elderly woman's battered flashlight had become a symbol of this truth. It shone weaker than any generator, yet its meaning was stronger than steel, because what mattered was not the wattage, it was the willingness to keep someone from being left alone in the dark. That same question now reaches you. Who has lit a lamp for you in your hardest hour, and whose night could you brighten, even with something small? A phone call, a ride to the doctor, a meal carried across the street, a promise that no storm has to be faced alone. This is how light multiplies, not just through buildings, but through people. The Harbor Light Network is only beginning. New pins are being placed on the map. Charleston, Jacksonville, Norfolk. Each site will carry the same vow, no elder left behind, no patient left unseen. But the true network stretches further still into homes, neighborhoods, kitchens, and hearts. Grant often says, steel holds walls, trust holds lives. Claire adds quietly, and compassion holds memories. Together, their voices echo a truth larger than themselves. The final applause of Dedication Day has faded, but the call remains, to build, to serve, to remember. So, tonight, as you listen, I invite you to pause. Think of one light someone gave you. Think of one light you could give. Maybe it is as simple as sitting with an elder, listening to the same story for the 10th time. Maybe it is offering your generator cord to a neighbor's fridge. Maybe it is writing a note of thanks to a nurse who stayed past her shift. These acts may seem small, yet together, they form the glow that storms cannot extinguish. Claire looks at the map often, red pins turning to yellow. yellow to green. Each new harbor is a beacon, but each act of kindness, each memory of care, is a beacon too. The question is no longer what Claire or Grant will build. The question is what you will carry forward. Because the story of Harbor Light is not finished. The next chapter belongs to you. So, I ask, whose darkness will you enter with a light? Whose storm will you help weather? Whose hand will you hold, steadying them until the morning comes? Not everyone can build a hospital, but everyone can light a lamp, and maybe, just maybe, that lamp will be the very one someone remembers, long after the storm has passed. The story of Harbor Light is not only about storms and buildings. It is about the quiet strength that ordinary people carry, and the way trust can be rebuilt even after it has been broken. Claire began as someone overlooked, a secretary whose worth seemed limited to schedules and notes. Yet, when the storm came, she discovered that her calm voice and steady hands could anchor an entire community. Grant, a man of wealth, learned that true power is not in money or control, but in transparency, compassion, and the courage to stand beside others in their darkest hour. The lesson is simple, but profound. You do not need grand resources to make a difference. A flashlight in an old woman's hand, a neighbor's meal carried across the street, a promise to sit beside someone in their fear. These small acts are lights. And when many people carry them, they can outshine even the fiercest storm. For us, especially as we grow older, the question is not how much we have built, but how many lights we have left burning in others' lives. Because in the end, those lights become the legacy that carries on long after the storm has passed. Thank you, dear friends, for spending your time with us and listening to this story. If it touched your heart, if it reminded you of the lights that others once lit for you, we invite you to keep that light moving forward. Please remember to like this video, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of hope and healing. Together, we can keep these lights burning, one story at a time.